Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Nilanthan. Over the last couple of weeks, we have seen an interesting and alarming phenomenon in the world or on the world's stage, and that is the weaponization of economic tools. Now, we all know that countries, governments, they use economic pressure on other countries. But we are seeing this happen to an extent where it's not just using economic pressure, but it is economic warfare that has begun. And we saw this very clearly in the last 10 days or so. We had Donald Trump declaring an economic D-Day on Iran, which was just 2 days ago. Then we had the collapse of negotiations between Canada and the United States, and now there is an economic war going on between those two neighboring countries who have been friends for centuries. To discuss all this and the impact of it, I have with me Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, who is, of course, the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. Good evening and welcome, Nilanthan.
Good evening. Interesting times as always.
Of course, we live in the times of Donald Trump, and the verdict is still out on whether the world will survive his term. Fortunately, just over 2 years to go. But you and I can talk about that in 2029, certainly, perhaps. Right. So, Nilanthan, let's talk about, first of all, economic D-Day. And this was much touted. The US having bombed and shelled and fired missiles at Iran over the last, goodness, what is it now, 6 months? And Iran has not budged an inch. And so Donald Trump announced that there would be economic sanctions, what he called economic D-Day, which is a very peculiar term indeed. D-Day, of course, was the historic storming of the Normandy beach in France by the Allies against Germany in World War II. And that was quite a massive undertaking, which the world had not seen up to then and has not seen since then. But here we have Donald Trump talking about economic D-Day. It's been 2 days. Are we seeing anything substantial, or do we have to wait for a few more months to figure out what this economic D-Day actually means?
Yeah, so there are a few things that I think we can flag immediately, which are quite interesting observations. The first is, if we notice who made this announcement, it was not the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. It's the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent who did this, and he's kind of been on his own tear for the last 15 to 20 months or so. He was one of the big proponents of the whole weaponization of tariffs agenda. He was a big proponent of what they call the big beautiful bill, the Trump tax bill. He's been a big proponent of things like stablecoin and using cryptocurrency for American geopolitical interests. Played a big role in trying to save the Japanese yen just a week or so ago. So what we are seeing here is the US Treasury very clearly being used as an instrument of power projection rather than just economic growth. So where you're using your GDP not just as a basic measurement of how prosperous you are, you're using your GDP as a tool, as a weapon to get what you want on the world stage. So if we were to look at these sanctions by themselves, first of all, as you know, Iran has been very heavily sanctioned since the Khomeini revolution. And in the mid-2000s, when Ahmadinejad started using a lot of nuclear rhetoric, the West kind of used that as an advantage to turn the Iran nuclear program into a big deal, and more sanctions were slapped. And then during the Obama and Trump administrations, even more sanctions were slapped. And the Biden administration didn't remove any of those sanctions either. So Iran is already arguably the most sanctioned nation in the world. So I'm not too sure what they can do to the Iranian economy that they haven't already done. There have been about 60 entities and individuals who have been named sanctioned, whom the Americans are planning to sanction. But it's already been a decades-long systematic sanctions regime that Iran has had to live with. So using Normandy terminology, while it might be a somewhat effective PR tactic, at least with their vote bank, the use of warfare terminology, so to speak, because this was essentially, it sounded like a declaration of war, and you don't really find treasury secretaries speaking that way around the world. But I feel like this is now going to be the norm. This is not a one-off thing. We're going to see a lot more of this moving forward, because this is how the world had always functioned until very recently, where you use your economic might as an instrument of warfare. It's just that over the last 50 to 60 years, that's kind of become taboo. There have been exceptions to the rule. Like, for example, in 2014, when the Russians invaded Crimea, there were sanctions on even Russian energy giants like, Rosneft and Novatek and all of that, which created a huge split. And the Russians ended up creating an alternative system, which we can get into as well. On paper, I don't see how D-Day can be created on an economic level against a country like Iran, considering that it's kind of been D-Day for them since 1979 from a sanctions point of view.
So what do these sanctions mean? Because it's obviously cutting off ties with any Iranian companies or any companies which do business with Iran, but that's already in place and has been so for some time now. And of course, Iranian oil is intercepted when it is going out of the Strait of Hormuz, intercepted by the US armed forces. On the other hand, Iran cannot be effectively blockaded because it is bordered by 5 or 6 different countries, from Iraq to Turkey to Pakistan to Afghanistan. So those borders cannot be closed off at all. I mean, there's no way you can cross from Iran to Pakistan on foot and nobody would know. So what does this mean? Because you can, Iran could trade with those countries quite effectively, selling their goods and buying goods from those countries.
Yeah, I mean, and 80% of Iran's energy exports go to China anyway. So if anybody's serious about D-Day, they've got to be ready to take on the Chinese. They've got to be ready to sanction Chinese companies like what they did with the Russians in 2014. And I personally don't see that happening. So right now, how the shadow supply chain, especially the Iran-China black market oil route functions is, so it goes from Iran, it goes to a place called Shandong in the eastern coast of China. Shandong has a lot of what are called teapot refineries. These are smaller independent refineries that don't really have international branches and all that. So even if the Americans sanction these companies, these refineries, no harm done. So the major state-owned Chinese refineries will not take Iranian oil because they don't want to risk a confrontation with the Americans for no reason. So the smaller independent teapot refineries, most of them in Shandong, take them in, refine Iranian oil, and it moves on from there. So unless anybody is ready to take on the Chinese themselves, I don't see this being effective. In fact, Scott Bessent even said in an op-ed piece he wrote for the Financial Times that a big part of this push will be taking on the enablers of Iran. Now, one would assume that the enablers of Iran would be China and Russia, China much more so, but it's also quite hard to see what they could do against China, given China's monopoly on refining critical minerals, China's kind of monopoly on global construction, things that we've discussed. over the last year or so on these television shows. So yeah, I don't see any major strike per se that can be economically inflicted on the Iranians at the moment.
I mean, if China was not such a strong trading partner of Iran, perhaps it would work, this economic D-Day. But China is a huge trading partner of Iran.
80%.
And also, you can't force China to do anything. They are an economic powerhouse themselves. In the same way that other countries can't force the United States to do what they want, it's not going to work.
Yes, and this once again goes back to a theme that we've discussed many times, which is the US dollar, and how all of these grand games can essentially be tied down to either trying to retain the dominance of the US dollar or trying to boost the dominance of the shale revolution, the energy dominance aspect of it. And in that sense, what this does is it gives the United States some kind of economic mechanism to take on the shadow supply chain, the black market, so to speak. Because as you know, when it comes to energy and currency, black markets have functioned before. So North Korea, heavily sanctioned, Iran, heavily sanctioned, and these countries have had to survive by depending on these shadow supply chains. But in 2014, all of that changed when the Russians were sanctioned, especially Russian giants were sanctioned. Russia has since then been creating a massive shadow supply chain, black market supply chain, ghost ships, ghost supply chains, where Russian commodities can go in and out. And then with the invasion of Ukraine, that expanded into an even bigger operation since Russia got sanctioned even more. So there's essentially a global system that's operating at the moment, which we don't really see show up in the numbers. So for example, if you were to look at global oil inventories, what you see on all these websites and what all these oil experts put up on their social media handles, those are not the only reserves. There are huge offsite reserves that never actually come in here. When we look at the global, ships that carry fuel, what we see as the official register is not the entire picture. There are many, mostly Russian ships that run these operations as well. So I think the larger intent here is to start using the economic tools at America's disposal to take on this shadow supply chain, this alternate system, as strongly as possible before it's too late. It's kind of like the Americans have woken up and realized that many of the things they were good at, they have now surrendered to the Chinese. And sanctions are not going to work because the Russians have already built this extensive system now. So they've got to find a very multifaceted way to take that on. And this is probably a long-term strategy for that. But as a short-term tool against Iran, as I've been saying all day long, I'm very skeptical about the effectiveness of that.
Right. So the likelihood of economic D-Day working is very, very low. I'd be very surprised if it forced Iran back to the negotiating table at all.
Yeah, I mean, the question once again becomes, what can you do that you haven't already done to them? And if you can't do what you haven't already done to them, then why would they change their position now? And as we've said before, there are many elite factions within the United States and within Iran that greatly benefit from the continuation of this conflict. The Iranian political class gains greatly from this, and the American industrial class benefits greatly from this. So given that it's ordinary people on both sides that are suffering, I don't see anything on the cards. On the black market, the Iranian currency, the rial, is currently going for, I think it's something like 2 million rial for a dollar, or some absurd number like that. Imagine for us, what is it, like 330 rupees at this point, a dollar, and we complain. Imagine it going to the point of 2 million on the black market. That's how shattered Iran's economy is as well. And you now have very serious, inflation-related worries on the American side as well. But once again, at the industrial level, at the political level, That's where people make most of the decisions. And if those people are profiting, then it doesn't really matter how much the people at the bottom suffer. You're not going to see policy per se changing.
Now, Nilanthan, in my experience, wars really don't take very long. A year or two, in the case of the world wars, I think 5 years and 6 years, but not much longer than that, unless someone or many people are significantly profiting from it.
Yes.
And the way that this particular Iran war has been going on or not going on indicates to me that a lot of people are making a lot of money on both the Iranian side and more so on the US side, and also many of the Gulf states themselves.
Absolutely. And we've discussed this before as well, where many of the Gulf states, particularly the two big ones, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have other alternates, even if the Hormuz Strait is blocked off, to them selling their current reserves at a premium is not such a bad deal. As far as the United States is concerned, as we've discussed before, oil, gas, helium, urea, all kinds of major industries are now, making bank once again. In the IRGC on the Iranian side, there are lots of people profiting from this, both on a personal level and on a collective level. And you have Iran now being able to sell its oil at a premium, whereas earlier it had to sell its oil at a very, very cheap discounted rate. So yeah, if you're somebody making money on either side, it's happy days. But for the rest of us just trying to make a living, it's a very, very long winter ahead.
War is big business, isn't it?
Always, always.
And the manner in which this particular Iran war has been fought, stop, start, suddenly you'll have a ship getting hit by some missiles, and for a week nothing happens, and again you'll have some drone attacks. It almost seems like they're not actually fighting anymore.
And sometimes it turns out that the attack on the ship was completely fictional and made up. So all it takes is now a social media post to manipulate the oil prices. You just put out a post that some ship has been attacked, a fictional attack, a fictional ship that never actually existed. If enough outlets pick up on it, you can just toy around with the price. So essentially these social media misinformation and disinformation campaigns, because there's so much money involved, starts playing a huge role as well.
Yes, indeed. A couple of weeks ago, some of our competitors did report the sinking of a vessel in the Red Sea. Mm-hmm. And we at Newsfirst, of course, double and triple check everything. And I could not find this vessel.
Exactly.
And so we didn't report it at all. And then we haven't heard anything about that.
Yeah, but that news story had such a big impact on the price of commodities, on the price of insurance, on how people were dealing with the Hormuz Strait. Just one random fake article destabilized the entire thing.
Absolutely. Fake news, disinformation. Right. Now let's get to the other economic war, which is an extraordinarily surprising one. USA versus Canada. Who goes to war with Canada, economic or real? Would you like to explain what in the world happened?
So this has been brewing for a while. So for a long time, Canadians have felt that Americans take them for granted. I remember there's a former US Secretary of State even who said that Americans kind of treat Canada like the air or water, where they kind of feel entitled to just use it. So there's that sense of dissatisfaction on the Canadian side. And on the American side as well, there's this idea that the Canadians are kind of free riders, that they have the ability to be this kind of, liberal, progressive state because they live under the security umbrella of the United States, and they kind of look down on, gunslinging Americans or whatever, when it's those gunslinging Americans who make sure that Canada can be a kind of welfare-ish society. So that resentment now, once it comes to, once again, the weaponization of trade, once it comes to talks of tariffs and things like that, clearly incompatible demands on both sides. Unfortunately for Canada, we've got to remember that 75% of all Canadian exports go to the United States. Only 15% of American exports go to Canada, right? So you don't really need economic theories. We just need common sense to see who's at a disadvantage here. Where 75% of all Canadian goods exports goes to this one American market. So antagonizing them, clearly they have a lot more to lose. And also, I mean, while this doesn't mean anything, there's also a number that most people aren't aware of, which is that about 90% of all Canadians live within 100 miles of the American border. You know, I mean, 100 miles might seem a lot to a Sri Lankan, but by North American standards, 100 miles is nothing. In fact, if we were to reduce that down to 50 miles, I think something like 65% of the whole of Canada still lives within 40 or 50 miles of the United States. So there are dense populations. The people are a lot closer to the United States than we would assume when we look at the map, because Canada is a pretty big country as well. So it's unfortunate that it's come to this, level. If you remember, there was this major speech that Prime Minister Carney made about a year ago about, the changing world order, and everybody shared it. Everybody said, wow, even though he was just repeating what many of us have been saying for 10 or 20 years, the fact that a Canadian leader was saying it made a lot of people pay attention. But a few months later, he was back to saying that the US is Canada's greatest ally and that US security interests were Canadian interests and all that. So there have been a lot of ups and downs. The United States still needs Canada as an energy partner, because even though they have the shale revolution, I'm sure you know this, the oil that you dig up through the shale revolution is light and sweet. What we mean is the sulfur content and the thickness of the fuel. United States, US refineries typically run on heavy, sour crude oil rather than light and sweet crude oil from the Gulf Coast and from Canada and so on. So most American oil refineries, even though they produce the largest quantity of light and sweet oil in the world, most American refineries work on heavy and sour oil, which they get from the Gulf Coast and Canada, while they sell the light and sweet oil to the rest of the world, particularly Europe and all that. So the Americans still need the Canadians as an energy partner, but from a trade standpoint, the Canadians are unfortunately hostages of the US at this point. 75% is not a small number.
But what we saw 2 days ago was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney actually walk out of the negotiations which were being held in the United States, walked out with his team and said, that's the end of that, we're going home. So what sparked that?
I think clearly months and months of frustration. I think clearly the Canadians feel that there's a great deal of unreasonableness on the American side. It's kind of similar to what the Iranians say as well. They keep changing their demands, extremely unreasonable. They don't really care what the other side wants. They just turn up with a blanket set of conditions that's almost etched on stone, and they refuse to budge in any way. That kind of seems to be the Canadian critique as well.
So the US government doesn't actually negotiate anymore. They sort of go, into talks and just dictate terms and expect others to follow those terms.
Yes, it's kind of like the landlord telling the tenant that the landlord doesn't really care to negotiate what the rent price is. It's the landlord's property and the tenant can either accept it or leave it. I mean, when 75% of your entire economy is dependent on selling stuff to the United States, an American hawk would say, why should we negotiate with them? They have to listen to us.
Interesting indeed. But do you expect things to calm down a little bit between the US and Canada?
I do. And over the last 4 years, we've seen these tensions rise and fall. So I wouldn't say this is a long-term split. But what this does show is that as far as trade is concerned, there's going to be a lot of difficulty maneuvering through that, particularly, and I'm not, trying to suggest something, but Canada has a major Alberta problem, which you and I have discussed before. Alberta is the biggest source of crude oil one of the biggest in the entire world, so one of the biggest in North America, and the Americans really want that, and the Albertans want to kind of secede from Canada. So if, the Alberta secession movement or separatist movement or whatever, federalist movement, whatever they want to call it, if they start pressuring the Canadian government, we know whose tacit support they have.
Interesting indeed. And now, in addition to that, Canada is not a nation which demands a lot, is it? It's they're fairly easygoing. They, it's easy to negotiate with them.
Yeah.
And from our standpoint, Sri Lankans, well, there are a lot of Sri Lankans who live in Canada.
Yes.
For the last several decades.
Yes.
And it may affect their jobs. Already Canada has a problem, a lot of unemployment. It's been rising, I think, over the past year or two. So this kind of economic tit for tat with the United States is going to be difficult to sustain.
Certainly. I mean, both Canada and Europe over the last 10 to 15 years have been on a serious deindustrialization path anyway, where if you look at their industries, it's all been shrinking because of environmental laws that have come in and made it virtually impossible for them to compete on a big industrial level because it's bad for the environment and climate change and so on. So Canada and Europe as a region were heading down the deindustrialization path anyway, and this kind of tension is only likely to exacerbate that.
Right. We are going to take a commercial break now. I am in conversation with Nilanthan Niruthan. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Get accurate and trusted news alerts delivered straight to your mobile phone. Activate the Newsfirst Dialogue SMS service. Simply scan the QR code. Subscribe today and stand a chance to win a brand new smartphone or television in our lucky draw.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I'm in conversation with Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. Nilanthan, another interesting development over the last couple of weeks, the Mecca Defense Agreement, an agreement signed between Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and Turkey or Turkey, which basically stipulates that if any one of these three countries is attacked by somebody, then it is an attack on all three. Whether this actually would play out in practice, we may never know. But how did this come about all of a sudden?
Yeah, so after Israel's attack on Qatar last year, we saw the first version of this signed between the Pakistanis and the Saudis, a bilateral defense agreement. And at that time, if you remember, a lot of people once again started hailing this as some kind of dawn of a new age in, West Asian Muslim geopolitics, and that this is the start of a Muslim NATO. And now with the recent kind of making it a trilateral arrangement has once again sparked all of this because of the collective security, the collective self-defense clause. However, what we need to remember is that this is not a Muslim NATO in that sense. NATO was an organization formed with a very clear ideological enemy. NATO was an alliance that was created explicitly, specifically to counter another alliance, which was the Soviet alliance. This is not like that. Saudi Arabia's enemies are not Pakistan's enemies. Pakistan's enemies are not Turkey's enemies. Turkey's enemies are not Saudi Arabia's enemies, right? They all have very, very different security concerns. So, for example, when will there be any unity between the Saudis and Turkey on the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, right? Saudi Arabia is such a close military partner of the United States, while Turkey is becoming closer and closer getting closer with the Russians. So what exactly is the reconciliation there? And with NATO, the other side clearly felt that the collective response threat was a serious threat. The Soviets genuinely felt that an attack on one NATO country was likely to spark a collective attack from NATO. I'm talking about back in the Cold, of course, now NATO is useless. Back in the Cold War, there was that belief. Whereas with this, no, the Iranians don't actually believe that attacking the Saudis would now have the Pakistanis bombing them. The Indians don't believe that fighting the Pakistanis will now suddenly have the Saudis, hovering into Indian airspace and bombing. Like the rivals of these countries don't actually believe that the other side will intervene. And in fact, since that bilateral agreement was signed between the Saudis and the Pakistanis, Pakistan has been at war with the Afghan Taliban. There was nothing that the Saudis did. The Saudis have been attacked by the Iranians, including one of the largest oil refineries in the Middle East. The three major oil refineries in the Middle East, one in Saudi Arabia, one in the UAE, one in Kuwait, all three were attacked. And the Aramco Saudi Arabian refinery is one of the biggest, which the Iranians went after. What did the Pakistanis do? Nothing. And the Pakistanis want to mediate. So everybody knows that these countries are not really going to come to each other's help in an actual kinetic war. However, it is something that's interesting just to reframe the geopolitical chessboard. It's a nominal move. It's not a move that's going to change the pace or the direction of the chess game itself. It's just an interesting cluster that we should pay attention to at the moment.
Right. And as you mentioned, this does have certain ramifications on South Asia, because Pakistan is very much a South Asian country.
Yes.
And Pakistan is, even at this moment, in a semi-state of war with Afghanistan. There are bombings and shellings which go on. And of course, the Indo-Pakistani rivalry has, it's gone back nearly 80 years now. And from time to time, there are flashpoints.
Yes.
So what you're saying is this is not as though suddenly an Indo-Pakistani clash is going to result in
Saudi airstrikes on
or Turkish troops ending up in Mumbai or something like that.
I don't think even the signatories of the pact intend for that. However, it's interesting, if you look at a vast majority of the media discourse, it does make it look like this is some world-changing Muslim NATO that's going to now completely realign the world order and all that. That doesn't really play out when we apply common sense to this analysis.
Absolutely. And again, at Newsfirst, we looked at this particular defense pact with a rather skeptical eye.
That's right.
And didn't, over-glamorize it or exaggerate it because it just seems a little odd. Right. Now, the other interesting story on the world stage, which of course involves the United States, what doesn't these days, is the US propping up of the Japanese yen. And this, it's a surprise. Why would the US support the Japanese yen, and how did this come about?
So I think there's a very interesting story, because this explains why there's so much bad analysis around the world, because the economics experts know very little about international relations, and the international relations experts know very little about economics. And unless you know the basics of both, you're not going to understand something like why the US Treasury had to bail out the, Japanese yen, right? So first of all, the Japanese yen has been declining steadily for the last 4 years. It reached kind of like something like a 40-year low or something like that. And therefore, what the Americans did, and this is what's important, this is why Scott Bessent is clearly intending to weaponize the dollar and weaponize currency on the global stage. Usually, what do the Americans do to help out the Japanese economy, like what they did during COVID and all that? They give them currency swaps. This is what most large countries do with their smaller allies who are facing currency-related problems. Hey, let's go for a currency swap. But the Americans, they didn't do that this time. What they did was they sold off their reserves of the euro to buy yen. As in, they didn't even sell off dollars to buy the yen, to increase the demand for the yen. They sold off euros. There's a double geopolitical message there. It's a message to Europe that if Europe does not get aligned with American interests, Americans have large reserves of the euro that they can sell off if they want to and drive down the demand for the euro. And it's also a message to the more reliable, smaller allies like Japan, like South Korea, and so on, to say, hey, look, if your economy starts tanking, if your currency starts crashing, there are always things like this that we can step in to do for you. Because the Americans can almost do this indefinitely. It's not dollars they are selling off to buy yen. So they're not being injured by this in any way. And of course, the other geopolitical strategic reason the Americans had to do this is because the American economy is propped up entirely by the financial capital that pours in, right? So America spends far more than it earns. It imports far more than it exports, which is Trump's problem. So there's a major trade deficit. This deficit is offset by the money that comes into the United States in the form of, foreigners wanting to buy American real estate, American bonds, the American stocks, and so on. And the Japanese have over $1 trillion of American bonds. And if the Japanese currency crashes, the Americans, the Japanese would start selling off American bonds, and that would start to cause serious problems for the American economy. So it was both an economic maneuver to save a key partner and stabilize their own economy, and it was also a kind of geostrategic message to both their cooperative allies and their kind of non-cooperative allies, just as a reminder of what they can do because of their currency dominance over the world.
Right, and I suppose it helps that the Japanese Prime Minister has got on quite well with Donald Trump.
Yes, as in she does what Trump wants many of these American allies to do, which is to be a proud American ally. This is their problem. I mean, earlier you said the Canadians are very fair in their negotiations. Well, that's one of the problems from the American perspective. They are not looking for fair. They are looking for whatever suits the power dynamic. If I'm only dependent on you for 15% and you're dependent on me for 75%, I'm not looking for you to treat me fairly. I'm looking for you to treat me like a big brother. So what they want is for the allies to be very vocal about their support for American foreign policy, American values, American leaders, what America stands for in the world. They want them to be part of the PR game in that sense as well. And the Japanese Prime Minister, as you pointed out, has been more than happy to kind of play into that. And clearly, I mean, Scott Bessent even said in the speech, Japan is a key ally and we will not let this happen to them. I mean, imagine the Treasury just intervening to do something like this. This is a very, serious strategic move that a lot of people are not paying attention to.
Makes me feel quite envious, because when the Sri Lankan rupee was crashing in 2022, no one stepped in to save us, but then we are not a major trading partner of the United States.
And if anybody suggested that we have a generational partnership with another country, the way that the Japanese would, the public sentiment among the intellectuals here would be to, get very, very triggered and upset by it, because they worship neutrality as some kind of virtue. So we don't have that luxury.
Non-alignment.
Yeah, I mean, non-alignment, strategic autonomy. There are multifaceted diplomacy, multilateral diplomacy. There's lots of fancy jargon that you can use to justify running around with no direction over 75 years. So at least Japan does not make that mistake. Japan knows that there are certain sacrifices to be made in order to have a larger safety net, while we just thump our chests about sovereignty and autonomy.
But this goes back to something that you and I have discussed on this program many times, which is that we in Sri Lanka have not yet properly identified our national interest.
Exactly.
What's good for us, whether we like it or not. I mean, it's not about what we like, it's what is good for us.
Exactly.
We haven't identified that.
Yeah,
the Japanese have.
Exactly. We don't even have as I often say, we don't even have a piece of paper with a crayon scribbling of what our objectives are, where it can just be transferred from regime to regime. We have no political consensus on this. So it just keeps changing based on whichever new government comes to power. I mean, anything that even a 5-year-old can do, we haven't done, as I always keep saying. And until we rectify those problems, we are much better off discussing the world than our own neighborhood, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, indeed. But getting back to the Iran situation, is there no end in sight?
No, I mean, the question then becomes, okay, for there to be an end in sight, something has to give, right? So is it going to be the collapse of the Iranian economy? Is it going to be the collapse of the Iranian political establishment? Or is it going to be them relenting on some demand? I don't see them relenting on any demands. It would be very difficult for the political class now to kind of fizzle out, particularly after they've managed to, keep a close rein over dissent and protests and all that. Economically, they are vulnerable. Maybe they will be shattered that way. I don't see the Americans compromising there at all. There's now this age-old American cliche trap that everybody falls for, assuming that the Republicans are these pro-war gunslingers and the Democrats are these anti-war peace-building hippies or whatever. It's never been the case. These are both very heavily pro-war parties. What I mean by that, not as an insult, what I mean by that is both parties are in favor of the American grand strategic vision for the world. Both parties are in favor of American power projection over the world. Both parties are in favor of retaining the dominance of the US dollar. Both parties are in favor of the Americans controlling the world's, critical choke points. So in that sense, there's no difference between them. In fact, if we were to look at the last 70 to 75 years of American history, there's nothing for me, at least, to suggest that the Democrats will somehow reverse all of this. They hate Trump, but they certainly don't hate war. So where will the give happen? Unless Iran's economy collapses, I don't see any side capitulating on anything.
Now, as much as we have discussed the fact that Iran has withstood all these, I mean, it's been quite a battering since February, and both by warfare and economically. But they have still managed to hold out. However, economies can't hold out forever.
No.
We saw this with World War I, where Germany was not defeated on the battlefield. In fact, they beat the Russians, causing the Russians to sue for peace. And then the fighting was on the Western Front with, the United States, France, and the UK. But the Germans, although they were not winning, they certainly didn't lose on the battlefield.
That's
but
right.
You had an economic crunch.
Yes.
I mean, there were shortages of food and a lot of issues within Germany, which caused a lot of problems. So countries, however strong, can be brought to the negotiating table through economic means.
You're absolutely right. And from the very beginning, this was a war of attrition. From the very beginning, this was a contest over who would blink first. Would the Iranian regime collapse first? or would the American regime collapse first? So from the start, this has been the race. So can Trump hold on for a bit longer and wait for the Iranian regime to collapse? Or can the Iranian regime somehow once again prove all its detractors and its critics wrong by holding on? So it just comes down to this basic kind of ticking time bomb on both sides, and whoever holds out first essentially gets to win. We've known this from the very beginning. It's taken on many different dimensions. The Iranians have seen through phase one. Phase one was who would blink first in terms of the military confrontation. Now with the Americans, there are rumors of them running out of long-range precision missiles, the ships there not being able to be present for a very long period of time because of repairs. You have to pull them in, send them back, pull them in, send them back, and all that. So there seems to be a bit of a military disengagement that the Iranians have managed to achieve. But now the question is, can they survive phase two, which is the economic warfare side? And as you pointed out, even though this D-Day push itself might not be effective as a unique construct, the long-term damage that accumulates on the Iranian economy, that has been accumulating on the Iranian economy at some point of time, and as I've always many times said on your show, when you're pregnant, at some point of time, the baby will come out.
Now, Nilanthan, we have, of course, the US midterm elections coming in November. And as you just said, even if Trump doesn't do well, if his Republican Party loses control of either one or both houses of Congress, we're not likely to see much of a change in American policy. But is Trump worried?
I think Trump is worried in the sense that if they gain control, they can make life hard for him. They can annoy him at every turn. They can try to sabotage him at every turn. They can try to trip him up and make his life miserable they can try that at every turn. But does this mean they suddenly become anti-war? Does this mean they suddenly become pro-Iran? Does this mean they would suddenly, demand that America surrenders to Iran? Will they suddenly demand that America capitulates to Iranian conditions? I don't think the Democrats would do that. If the Democrats did that, that would be disastrous for them when the actual presidential elections come along. So, no.
Right. And of course, in the US, the executive presidency is very powerful.
Absolutely. And one more thing to note here would be, look at how quiet the Democrats have been. The Democrats have been so quiet about what their position on the Iran war would be if they do take control of the House. So that itself should tell us that they are not as anti this war as we might think they are.
And the US economy is actually doing fairly well now, isn't it?
Life is hard for regular people because of inflation and stuff like that. So day-to-day people are certainly facing challenges and will continue to face challenges. But the industrial base has gotten kicking. It's just gone into a different gear. And eventually that will lead to, some kind of re-emergence of American prosperity locally again. But in the short run, I don't think it would be fair to say that ordinary Americans benefit from this war. Ordinary Americans still lose from this war. It's the industrial base that gains in the short run.
Now, one of the aspects of this war is that it's not been a war on the ground. Of course, thousands of Iranians have died, but I think only about 20 Americans have died.
Yes.
So you haven't seen hundreds of US soldiers coming back in body bags.
Exactly.
Which is one of those aspects which, tests a country's will to fight.
That's how the Vietnam War was lost.
Yes.
There were too many American soldiers coming back in coffins. And which is why these drone bombing campaigns against Pakistan and Afghanistan during the Obama years raised no public protest whatsoever, because there were no American soldiers coming back, because all these drones were Predator and Reaper drones dropping bombs from up in the sky. So here, once again, yes, there are odd casualties, but when you have 30,000 people dead on one side and 30 people dead on the other side. It's kind of hard to say that Iran has emerged the winner. If this is how you define victory, then, it's a very sad state of affairs.
Right. And we will leave it on that note. No doubt in the coming weeks we will see a lot more interesting developments, which you and I will discuss
Certainly.
in a couple of months' time. My thanks to Nilanthan Niruthan, who is, of course, the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies, CLAS. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.
TV